Hey, so welcome everyone to another Celo governance call. On this call, we have a few action items and discussion topics to cover. So yeah, let's get started. The first one is about on CGP 47. I believe Alberto's here. Correct me if I'm wrong. Alberto, are you here?
Hey, yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, you're here. So Alberto, you had some update on the proposal, right? Mostly on what would the allocation amount be specifically, right? But let's go over the proposal briefly again before we can talk about the allocation amount.
You want me to do a readout, or you want me to actually explain the motivation behind it?
The motivation, but more like just like a reminder. We already done the motivation before, but just like a recap. Like it can be as short as possible, no worries.
Sounds good. So today, the way our bridges work is when you try to bridge from any other chain into Celo, what happens is you move ETH, and if you don't hold Celo, then you have to go to an exchange and then buy Celo, or try to get your WETH and then try to change it for something else, which gives a really bad user experience, right? If someone that is coming over here for coming to the platform to ensure they have some, they can provide liquidity. It's a pretty hard thing to do for them. So the proposal over here is, and other bridges, some other bridges also do that, is to give the user some dust so they can actually do some transactions. The more I think about it, and some input I got from others offline, know that they could not make this call because of time zones. Like Rosie, for example, told me that they even believe that 1 Celo is too much, and we can discuss in this call whether it's 1 Celo or 0.1, given that the gas prices we have, even 0.1 Celo will allow you to do almost 10 transactions. But that's the idea. And in order to not attract too many bots, because right now, for example, on the optics bridge, if you actually leave the optics bridge, your ETH cost is very small. But when you come in, there's no dust. So the idea would be that the dust has to have a minimum amount that you actually bridge. Whether we want to do $50, the equivalent of $50 or $100, to ensure people are not just trying to take money coming in and going out.
Cool. And Alberto, so the latest update based on what we covered in a previous call, the latest one was about what was the ask amount, and and the ask is for 27,000 Celo to be allocated to this program from the Celo Community Fund, correct?
That's correct. If we do 1 Celo, that will be around, based on the number of a peak on the different bridges that we have, it will be around 27,000 Celo. But if we do less than 1 Celo, if we do 0.5, then it will be 15,000 Celo. I mean, around 13,500.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for the context. Yeah, so we kind of already went over this proposal last time, and it was more about trying to feel out the community in terms of what would like their thoughts on the proposal. And I think the thoughts were like, people are more like lenient on it because it kind of makes sense. And at least my personal perspective, and it in no way is like an authoritative perspective, but like I think an ask for 27K Celo from the community fund is beyond reasonable given how much already exists in the Celo community fund that is not being used. But I want to leave the floor for folks to actually comment on this and see if they have any feedback, any questions for Alberto.
Yeah, bump it up to 100,000 Celo. This is Victor from Bison Charles. Like, I think we should be, more generous. I think that the costs of bridging over are super expensive. They're not likely to get any cheaper. This will not be enough incentive for anybody to actually like bear the burden of bridging over. And it doesn't cost us that much money. So like, I don't think it'll be gamed.
Yeah, I think that's good feedback. Alberto, others, do you have any thoughts on this?
And sorry, Victor, your proposal is to increase, let's know for a second the allocation, rather, because I'm basing the allocation based on the number of transactions at 1 Celo. So are you saying that we should give more than 1 Celo?
Either give more than 1 Celo, or make more aggressive assumptions around the amount of bridging it's going to take place.
Cool. I think that's very reasonable feedback. Seems others agree. I want to leave the floor for others to ask other questions or give more feedback on the proposal before we try to finalize it and submit it to vote. I'll take people's silence to mean there's no feedback or question, but I'll give you a few more seconds just because we have a packed agenda.
Sorry, I realized I actually wasn't on mute, so sorry if it was noisy because of me.
Go for it. Go for it.
I guess, do we think it will be beneficial? I mean, it doesn't seem too expensive, but is there reason to believe it will lead to a benefit for people using optics? Like more people will use optics, I assume, is the goal.
I think to me, when I talk to several people who have provided liquidity that they were not on the Celo ecosystem, it was more of the pain that after you move it, you cannot transact, right? So it is trying to make a nicer user experience. Like for example, if you move, I don't know, Matic or Avalanche, in both of them, you actually get some dust and then you can do some transactions rather than having to go to Binance or Coinbase or whatever you have to go then to get some dust.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Sorry, I completely missed the point on dust. Makes sense.
A human raised their hand. Sorry, human.
Yeah, thanks. I was just gonna say, if the intention is more so to be a duster, then like why not reduce it to half a Celo, and then we could like double the amount of reach that we can have. Because if I agree that one Celo is not nearly enough to actually incentivize people to bridge over, but if the main purpose is the UX to, and I help contribute to Mobius, so I can vouch for like that's a big issue that people have bridging over, is they're always asking for dust. So I would lower that quite a bit because since Celo is so efficient, like one Celo would last a super long time. Yeah.
Cool. So it seems there's a few bit of feedback. One is to increase the amount to 100,000, and the other is to decrease the airdrop per address to 0.5, which should allow for about roughly 200,000 addresses to be able to bridge over. I think these are reasonable feedbacks, and maybe Alberto and others can discuss them further internally and see if you want to update your proposal with these feedback and maybe submit it to a vote. I'll leave some room for one final feedback or question, if anyone has any.
Now, another data point I wanted to give to people is when we analyze the number of and I only looked at, sorry for doing this, I sort of looked also at Mobius, but on Allbridge and Seller and others. But when I look, for example, at optics, the average user only bridged twice. What I mean by that is, it is the question then is whether we want to calculate, hey, we should do up to 10 or 20 dust, and then we can calculate more precisely that number, whether 0.5 or 0.3 or 0.7 or whatever that is, and we can base it on the 99 percentile do this number of operations, and this is how much costs in terms of way. That's
somebody might be unmuted. Please mute yourself if you're not speaking. But yeah, go on, Albertus.
no, sorry, I was just trying to say that we can calculate more precisely. Like we can say the average user today is doing 2-3 transactions. Let's say that because Celo becomes more successful, they could do up to 6. And then based on 6, that will be the way that they will spend. And therefore, this is the number. And if we really want to optimize just for the number of, so rather than having 200,000 wallets or transacting, we can actually optimize to a lot more because probably will be a lot, even less than 0.5.
Okay, cool. Great. So yeah, I guess then there'll be more analysis on the number, but with the feedback being that bump it up from 27K allocation to 100K, and potentially decrease it even maybe potentially based on the analysis below 0.5, if anything. Yes, Human, go for it.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, if I remember correctly, I believe either C Labs or the foundation is still like paying the gas fees for people to bridge back to Ethereum on optics. And if that's the case, why not end that program and then shift those funds to fund this? That way the community fund wouldn't even have to be, like, we wouldn't even have to go through governance. We could just ask the foundation to cover this.
That is another thing that is happening in parallel.
Yeah, I can comment on that. Yeah, we're definitely prioritizing not subsidizing migrating out of the Celo ecosystem, particularly paying ETH fees. Longer term, though, we do want kind of a decentralized governance and ecosystem. And so even though that's being decommissioned in terms of paying those Celo outbound bridge fees, I still think that the governance proposal here is valid because in the longer term, the Celo Foundation's role should really kind of diminish, and eventually it should not be a critical player. But we're on this kind of continuum in which the Celo Foundation starts out with a relatively larger role, but over time that role should diminish and be replaced by decentralized governance.
I hope that answered the question, Human.
I probably should have introduced myself. I'm Alex, leading finance at the Celo Foundation.
Thanks. Happy to have you, Alex. Okay, in the interest of time, I also want to leave room for the other points of discussion. It seemed there's a lot of good feedback, Alberto, that you received on the proposal. So I would say it's almost finalized with just like a few bit of feedback, and then hopefully within the next few weeks, we could start submitting it for a vote on the protocol. All right, so going back, so a few people in the community asked if they can discuss, there was a tweet by the Celo org Twitter account about a commitment of 40% of the Celo reserve become nature-backed assets. So here I'm inviting everyone to start talking about it. I can try to find the tweet for y'all while you all discuss it. We have here as well people from the protocol economics team that I invited to provide more context. But folks, feel free to kick it off. We probably just going to keep it for another 20, 25 minutes, because Pinocchio has other points they want to discuss. But yeah, feel free to kick it off. There's no actual CGP here, but folks want to discuss it prior to a governance proposal being made.
And yeah, happy to kick us off in this discussion. Actually, this tweet goes back to, and Marcus here working on Mento and the stability protocol. Yeah, happy to talk about this. And actually the tweet goes back to a popular forum post on Celo and regenerative finance that was kicked off by Sepp, where he started to discuss this idea that we already have in the initial Celo white paper about natural capital-backed currencies. This idea actually comes from Charles Eisenstein. Probably everyone in this call here is familiar with it, but it goes back to this idea that whatever backs money, people tend to do more of. When gold backed money, people minted more gold because it's like printing money. And actually the Celo stability protocol enables us to back currency with nature and regenerative assets. We've had a governance proposal last year that added to the Mento stability protocol to the Celo reserve tokenized carbon credit only in a very low percentage, because we saw this is tokenized carbon credit is a cool idea. It's already existing. It's out there. It's not the most liquid asset class out there, but it is at least relatively liquid. And it's the first asset that actually tokenizes something in the regenerative finance area. This allocation to tokenized carbon credit to the MOS token is still relatively low. And we saw that we need to basically kick off this ecosystem to develop more and better assets that can be used to collateralize the Celo currencies that have high quality, that are relatively efficient, that are transparent, that are decentralized, that are liquid, that are stable. And Slobodan and Paparon and others, also Brinley, added to this forum post what what the criteria for these assets are. So basically this 40% number is a vision we would like to go to. However, of course, the allocation in the reserve is governable, so the community can vote on it. But we actually would like to see more development in this space. Celo is the only carbon negative blockchain out there, so it should be the go-to blockchain for regenerative assets. This is why we also have the climate collective in place of projects that want to build more of these assets, and we actually would like to see more of this development. And therefore also, for example, Celo Foundation is giving grants in the space, and hopefully this Celo reserve commitment can also incentivize the space to build more of these assets, so that we in future can actually add more of these assets to the Celo reserve. Yeah, happy to kick off the discussion on this, and I know there are also others in the call who work on this, and yeah, feel free to back me up with topics I forgot, and also feel free to ask any questions on this.
Hi,
All right.
this is Slobodan, also working on reserve and stability. Just maybe a couple of points to add. And when you think about this in terms of governance proposal, which from my perspective, we should think about this more in terms of multiple governance proposals that would help achieving this goal. So either, making stepwise increases of that allocation, like in line with how this entire ecosystem develops. So let's say, I don't know, 5% this year, up to 10% next year, and so on. But also other proposals that could help develop or bring us towards achieving this goal. So for example, we could think about, using part of the ecosystem funds to, for example, incentivize LPs that would provide liquidity in those tokens, because a big problem, as Marcus already mentioned, even with the MOS token that we have already in the reserve, is that liquidity on DEXs is rather low, and the reserve would need to be able to trade in and out of those assets that, in the worst case scenario. So yeah, long story short, I think this 40% commitment should be thought in terms of like a range of different proposals that support this initiative, I think.
Got it. Yeah. Does anyone have any feedback, any questions on the vision? The whole call was set up, for people to have a discussion.
I have a few questions actually. I'll start off with some high level ones, which is like one, how did you guys reach the number 40%? Like what sustainability analysis did you do? What kind of economic analysis did you do to reach that number?
So as discussed, and this is probably a very general answer, I think the 40% is more a vision than a exact number, and basically a vision that we probably need other assets in this reserve as well for different reasons, for diversification, for stability, and so on. But actually we need a sufficiently high number to basically deliver on this vision of natural capital backed currencies or nature backed currencies. I think in terms of economic analysis, we basically try to analyze all these assets that are out there in different ways, basically simulating how much they could add to stability, simulate them, look at historic prices. Of course, looking at the history of these assets out there, it's hard because the history is relatively short. What we've seen with adding the first very low percentage to the reserve in terms of the MOS token, we've seen that during the recent volatile markets we've seen in the crypto world, this is actually the only token out there that was very stable. It even increased in price during the time of high volatility. So it shows, even with this short history, that this actually can add some diversification, because probably these assets are driven by different risk factors. However, just looking at short histories is probably not the solution. Therefore, we're trying to continue to work on scenario analysis and add other and add more research. But for now, this is basically more a goal or a vision than a economically derived number.
Gotcha. Okay, I guess whenever like the foundation speaks, though, like a lot of people assume like you know, a lot of governance proposals have been initiated by C-Labs or the foundation. So I guess like, do we expect that to be common practice, that people like propose change? I know you said it's kind of just like a goal, but like I get it's more kind of like the intent behind that, I guess. Like do we really want people like submitting proposals like that dramatic going forward, and like just the precedent that sets?
Yeah, as you said, it's not a proposal. It's for now a goal and a discussion. No written governance proposal yet.
Gotcha. Okay. And then with regards to the MOS tokens, like I think that's a fair point, but I think it's important to also note that the amount of MOS tokens in the reserve is more than the liquid market of MOS tokens. So that price appreciation doesn't like really matter if it's not liquid. And I think that's kind of an important problem with all natural capital backed currencies right now in particular. Additionally, I kind of wanted to touch on, like you said, you're on the Mento team. Something I've been pretty vocal about recently is that we need to decentralize that Oracle. I think that's one of the like most important things we need to focus on as a community. But you guys had mentioned how that's like a super difficult task and there's no product that meets your guys' standard for that. So if we can't decentralize the price Oracle for just simple Celo to USD, Celo to Euro, how would we decentralize natural capital backed currencies, the price oracles for that, or whatever data oracles are coming in? And how would we decentralize the ownership of these assets that would likely need to be run through a holding company?
Yeah, fully agree on all these points. There's like a lot of work that has to go into that, and it's absolutely critical work that has to go in there. In terms of basically the liquidity of the assets, also, yeah, you're right, and probably for the reserve, we need to look at different classes of reserve assets. We probably need a few more stable assets than just Celo and Bitcoin and ETH in the reserve. On the other hand, Celo and Bitcoin and ETH are actually the reserve assets that are the most liquid. So we have to differentiate between just looking at price volatility and just looking at liquidity. And there is probably a trade-off, and we have to continue to discuss this trade-off in this forum and with the community to find an optimum in this trade-off. And yeah, all points are fully valid. We have to decentralize everything around the reserve, both like price oracles. And I think there are different developments that help us here. Of course, like having more decentralized exchanges, also deploying on Celo also helps the reserve, because then we can broaden the oracles, we can broaden the price fees, and this like all helps us here. And yeah, I think like several teams are working on it, but yeah, this is still work in progress.
Maybe as a quick follow-up to, sorry, just quickly on the MOS token, I think for the MOS token, there is a slightly special situation because even though the liquidity on Celo and the MOS token is quite small, they also have liquidity on ETH, right, with their other MOS version. And if you compare prices across Celo and ETH, they're pretty much the same. And this shows that the MOS token is priced as a carbon credit primarily, and it's not priced as a token. For example, like the KlimaDAO token, if you're familiar with them. And that's useful because this means that the reserve, even if it doesn't have much liquidity on DEXs to trade that token, the reserve would potentially also find a buyer just in the broader carbon market to offset emissions for that. So that's just a side note to carbon credit markets and why DEX liquidity there is not the only source of potential demand, essentially.
Yeah, and I just wanted to make like a quick comment. Hi, this is Mila from Brazil. Here, the government has created a new market that's called PSA, Pay for Environmental Services. It's the acronym for the Portuguese thing. It is mainly looking for services of like conservation, firefighting, monitoring of the lands, sometimes even registry. And they have just like set the legal rules on how to do this. At this point, I think they are linking to some REDD plus projects to make this move forward. But again, there will be tokens generated under this PSA thing that they're not like carbon credits. It's actually like the act of preserving the integrity of a land by having firefighters available, which sometimes we don't have it in here. So I just wanted to bring out like this new market opportunity because this is certainly like prone to tokenizing, but I don't know how and if something that could be used to integrate the reserve. And this is available not only for the Amazon rainforest, of course, but for the 5 biomes of Brazil. So there's a lot of land and a lot of things to do here.
No, I think that's a great call out, and I think this Celo Climate Collective more broadly is a great call to action. The feedback that I'd like to summarize from several community members is that we should, along with these types of announcements, have kind of a quantified liquidity metric by which we judge whether it should be contributed to the reserve. So in this case, you know, what level of liquidity would we need to feel comfortable for it to get to 10% of the reserve, 20% of the reserve, and eventually up to 40% of the reserve? I think basically attaching some econometric analysis and scenario analysis to that statement, I think would give the community a lot more comfort, because at the end of the day, if the reserve like screws up and for whatever reason, and there's a collapse in value, obviously, as we all know, that's going to impact the stable coins and everything that the ecosystem rests on. And therefore, the decision is really impactful to everybody building on Celo. And so I would just encourage us going forward. And again, this is summarizing feedback from multiple community members, that we accompany these statements and call to arms. Again, great kind of initiative with this econometric analysis and clear timelines of what milestones need to be reached before we would get to that 40% mark. And yeah, feel comfortable with that, with the level of liquidity.
I mean, just a very quick, I mean, right now, there isn't really any assets we could put into the reserve that would have enough liquidity. And the closest type of assets we see are these carbon tokens, but I'm not aware of any like non-carbon tokens, other regenerative assets. So there's clearly just a long way to go in terms of coming up with tokens that are representing regenerative assets. So on that point, how many people are currently working on that within, say, C Labs and the foundation? And I think there's some funding actually, is there, for companies that are trying to develop more regenerative assets, and what's the status on that?
Slobodan, I think you have a good overview on projects that are coming into the ecosystem, and that's the nice thing. I fully agree on all these points. As soon as we have like more assets, we should do like proper research and analyze these assets and have clear criteria that we propose to the community. What would be minimum criteria to include an asset in the reserve from that. But yeah, with a goal like that, the cool thing is it actually kicks off development, and it actually helps or incentivizes people to work on these assets, because then they know there is a potential buyer out there, and this potential buyer, if I build this asset in a good way, could be the reserve, and the reserve could actually be significant in terms of size. And this was like backstory to this goal here. But yeah, Slobodan, I think we are seeing more and more projects who are building on these assets and in this space, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, that's also, you know, what the Climate Collective is doing more broadly. Actually, I just saw Nirvan is here. He's the program manager at the Climate Collective, and he, you know, started mapping out this entire ecosystem. So maybe, you know, Nirvan, maybe you could chime in here.
Yes, thanks, Slobodan. I was about to chime in here as well. And just a lot of new faces. I'm Nirvan, just joined as the program manager of the Climate Collective. And to Alex and Ronan, your points, and that's sort of what our first initiative is really creating what are the existing tokens that are already there. And as Ronan, you said, most of them are quite linked to carbon, but there's a lot of other areas that are being explored in this refi space, oceans and ecological services, a whole wide range of things. But as you said, I mean, first is kind of quantifying it in a Dune analytics sort of way in terms of the DeFi metrics, and then also about the ESG KPIs and ESG indicators as well, what these credits are actually, the impact is. So as Slobodan was mentioning, we have a large, the ecosystem is rapidly growing, especially since Toucan has kind of galvanized the space, Toucan and Klima last year. So we've got a lot of projects that are, you know, in various stages of development, figuring out which chain to launch on. And part of it is, you know, trying to bring them into the Celo ecosystem, which, as Marcus said, you know, we have a great first customer as the reserve. But that being said, we do need to develop a more formalized rubric to actually start being able to onboard the assets in a more kind of quantitative way, to other people's points here of scaling up more gradually into 40%. So that more generally, that is what we're working on right now, is really looking at this ecosystem, seeing what is out there and what can be brought onto Celo, and giving out grants for the same.
In the interest of time, I'll leave 5 minutes left for this discussion, if anything, just so we can go over the other items.
I'm just curious, for anyone on the economics team, like, are any of you confident in that 40% target number? Like, do you believe that we'll be able to maintain stability over the next, say, 5 years if we were to linearly scale to a 40% target allocation for natural capital?
I think it's a good target because like the types of assets that we see that are hopefully coming to Celo are very diverse, and therefore also the risk factors that these assets have are diverse, and adding to therefore the diversification of reserve assets. I mean, tokenized carbon credit is a start, but we are talking to projects that are working on carbon removal from the air, that are working on tokenizing trees, tokenizing land, tokenizing water, and so on. And I think this, like, actually, when we have these assets, actually, opens up a lot of opportunities. And therefore, I think it's a good target. If it's like 40% in 5 years, or if it's 30% in 3 years, I don't know. Let's hope that we attract a lot of protocols to deploy on Celo. This actually, I mean, in the end, this has two goals. One goal is, of course, creating nature-backed currencies. The other goal is to have Celo as being the layer one for all these protocols out there, because Celo is already carbon negative. Celo is super efficient in also in terms of emissions. Celo has like this on protocol level, this carbon offset. And therefore, the goal is twofold: to have all these projects in the Celo ecosystem, and to create nature-backed currencies.
Gotcha. I guess one last comment on this is, I don't think it, I mean, I personally don't agree with like leveraging the reserve assets as a marketing tool to like spur development that doesn't exist yet entirely. Like, for example, the Celo Foundation deployed or is in the process of deploying 100 million in DeFi for the people incentives, you know, I'd rather see it like a $5 or $10 million allocation from the foundation, using that to incentivize actual development, as opposed to like people just leveraging all the assets in the Celo reserve. Because Celo is already like a pretty big experiment. All of these algorithmic stablecoins are. And by doing this massive allocation, it feels even more like a very big experiment. And especially for people that are actually like trying to drive Celo stablecoin adoption, stability and like capitalization is like the most important thing for us. So I just like to see caution when approaching these topics.
Absolutely. And I fully agree that stability is the highest goal. The thing is with incentives, of course, at some point, incentives run out. And if we have a mechanism that basically allocates to these assets algorithmically, then we actually build the right mechanism to help also the planet with the ecosystem. And therefore, the goal is, of course, let's try to build it in a way that's sustainable with the highest goal of stability. But yeah, we'll for sure, like when looking into these things, we'll keep in mind that always the highest goal also of the reserve, of course, is stability.
Marcus, one idea for a possible metric is just like, you know, you can sell 50% of the natural capital back asset in the reserve without moving the market for that asset by no more than 10%. Just as like one example, I think everybody would feel more confident if there was a quantified liquidity threshold by which we judge. I think if we quantified it instead of being qualitative, it would take off a lot more of the concern around liquidity and soundness of the reserve's assets.
Yeah, I fully agree. A metric is important, and as we discussed before, it should be some trade-off between stability or price stability or low volatility and liquidity. There needs to be minimum requirements for liquidity. Of course, in these markets, it's sometimes hard to measure and hard to measure where this liquidity should live. And as we've seen just now also in the chat, Ronan, you're fully right. If you would measure it, for example, for MCO2, then this measure probably would look very complicated. On the other hand, this was an asset that was relatively stable in the reserve. And this is an asset that is actually in the reserve that is a token that has real carbon credit behind that actually can be liquidated in the carbon credit market then, so in the secondary market. So yeah, we're working on these measures. And point well taken on that we need to publish the research on this.
So I think we found there's a lot of like, you know, context and like clarification on the commitment with more like a vision than an actual proposal that's happening anytime soon. Hopefully we can continue discussing this, but in the interest of time, I do want to give other community members and their discussion topics the time of the day. So Ronan, you want to talk about your bullet points that you brought up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a quick question. I think there was discussion on the forum about this 3 of 9 multi-sig, which is in place before CGP gets approved. And it's not public yet, but there wasn't a clarifying post yet from, I guess it would be from Tim or somebody else from C Labs on what the approach and timeline will be for making that public. And let's start with that.
Let me see if Tim is actually on the call because he might have more context on this. He is not on the call. Can you remind me what happened? Because I remember there was a vote for the forum post. How did the discussion end? Because I remember Asa was commenting on it as well, right?
Yeah, so I guess the discussion needs to be kind of grouped up because there were just different views and I don't think there was a summarizing post. Tim, I think, suggested the multi-sig would be made public, although there wasn't a timeline given. And with respect to whether the multi-sig should be kept, I think there were mixed views in the forum. Some people felt it shouldn't be kept. Some people felt that it should be kept to provide a technical layer of security. I think that was Tim's view.
Okay. Here's my recommendation. just because I think like, yeah, if the forums continue discussing this and we're not going anywhere, maybe either we can create a GitHub issue on the governance proposal, like we need to, like, because this could be considered like a ticket for an issue with the underlying governance mechanism, and we can try to scope it out, and we'll ask them to figure out a solution there, and that way we can direct the conversation over there. I agree that we need to make it public. It's been a pain in the past just to get that, part of the governance process, moving to the next stage. Like the Celo Real as a great example recently, it didn't even pass the approval stage multiple times. So yeah, I mean, I would love to see this fixed. Absolutely. And yeah, let's scope it out on an issue together. DM me on Discord, we can work on this together. Let's see. And in a future call, I'll make sure Tim and Asa would be on the call so we can actually discuss it better and give you more context and stuff on what they're thinking, because I don't know what they're thinking. And all right, so your next bullet point item is the timeline roadmap for removing recovery multisig from optics. Within Celo forum post, optics v2 is live. I'll be honest, I don't have any context on this. I'm not sure if anyone who's working on optics is on this call.
Yeah, so I guess a few quick comments. Obviously, optics v1 had big issues. That's when I realized that actually there was a recovery layer on top. So it's not truly decentralized, which I guess makes sense for an initial rollout. Now we're on v2, which apparently has a more trusted multi-sig that is on top of it. But yeah, I mean, if optics is going to be good and decentralized, it would be useful to know what the timeline and approach is to actually removing the multi-sig from the top of it, because it's just not decentralized unless if that's still in place.
Yeah. Like I would love to help answer that question. I just don't have any context on that. I'm not even a member of any multisig within this kind of scope to help answer it. Does anyone here have any context on it within the call on the timeline, removing the recovery multisig from optics? If not, maybe we can move to the next action item.
Removing the recovery multisig from optics v2?
Yeah, I think it's this bullet point right here.
So I believe the recovery multisig for optics v2 is the governor multisig already. I think it was deployed with that, and so the multisig that was outlined in the optics v2 kind of post, I forget the exact. I think it was a 4 out of 7, if I remember correctly, multisig that is used both as the main governor for optics v2, but also as the recovery manager. So should something go wrong, that multisig can initiate recovery. Unlike in v1, the recovery time lock is set to 30 days. So it would take 30 days for the governor multisig to then take control of optics v2. And this is mostly only important in 2 cases. I think on the governor multisig only exists on 1 chain, on Celo. And so if you want to use it to upgrade parts of optics v2 on other chains, then you have to send governance messages. If something were to go wrong with that, then the recovery mode is kind of a break glass mechanism that would allow on the other chains for effectively the same audience to, after 30 days, kind of try to fix anything that went wrong. And so, yeah, I think when deploying optics v2, I think the team was very cognizant to do so in a way that made a lot more sense from a governance perspective than the v1 deployment. And so
are you saying it's going to be there permanently, the multi-sig? It won't be phased out?
For recovery mode, I think, I can't really speak for the optics team that's thinking about these things right now, but in general, my expectation is that they will continue to diversify the both the recovery manager and the main multisig, which right now are the same, over time, and eventually move to full on-chain governance using a token. When the main governor moves over to on-chain governance with a token, there becomes an interesting question as to whether or not you want to use a multisig for recovery. Given the 30-day time lock, you could argue that would be a pretty safe thing to do, because the community would have a lot of time to see that this has happened, and hopefully there would be a lot of communication about why that multisig would be taking that action, and presumably it would only happen in the case of some issue that needed some remedy. But again, I can't really speak for that team, but I can say that they're thinking very thoughtfully about this.
Yeah, because I guess it's cool that Celo has this optics technology, because it allows you, in theory, to trustlessly bridge with the other EVM blockchains, which is great for liquidity and interoperability. And of course, there's problems with bridging, but broadly, it's pretty good. And so if we're selling it as this trustless bridge, it just makes sense to me that we should be clear on what the pathway is for it actually to be trustless, because it isn't really trustless if it has the multi-sig on it, which is totally fine for the initial implementation, but it would be good to have clarity on it.
For sure. And I think it's less of an issue around the recovery manager, which, given the kind of 1 month time lock, I think isn't really a concern, a centralization concern. I think it's mostly just the regular governor, right? How do you continue to decentralize that? And from what I've heard, there's a plan, there's a token plan, and I think that's a nice plan.
Cool. There's a question by Human about this. Would this be a community-owned distributed token or primarily a C-Labs token?
Certainly not a C-Labs token.
Yeah. I hope that answered the question, Human. In the interest of time, let's go to the final bullet point. Ronan, you want to read it up first?
Yeah, thanks. I guess it's exciting to see new stables come on the platform, like the C-Real. And I wonder if how are we even deciding which one is up next? Is there some informal or formal list? Because it would be great to know what's in the pipeline and even get community input on the forum about which stuff we should prioritize. Something about Philippines I heard, but I don't really know what the pipeline is for this year.
Well, luckily you got a lot of people from the protocol economics team at C-Lab here, so maybe they can help provide some context.
So one thing Alberto already wrote, anyone can propose a token, a new stable that is added. In terms of pipeline, I think there was some time ago a forum blog post where the product folks discussed what the criteria could be in terms of a number of people using a mobile phone in a certain market, a percentage of unbanked in a certain market, and then also active community projects in a certain market, active integrations in a certain market, and then also for the oracles, of course, the potential to list Celo in the local currency so that we actually can deploy a Mento and have a price feed. I think these are all items on the list, and currently, we try to put together, and thanks Alberto for sharing that blog post, and we are putting together a list of regions that are up there. Philippine peso, I think, was on that list because it was cool to see after this Grameen pilot in the Philippines that people actually kept on using Valora, which is for payments, which is really cool. And therefore also there we saw a community impact. And in general, in the Philippines, many people have access to a phone and many people are unbanked. Therefore, it's a good market. But there are also many other currencies that could be on the list. We've heard in Discord channels recently that community members talk about Celo Pound, because that would be an easy win, since Celo is already listed against the British pound on certain exchanges, and therefore we could add it. Yeah, we can add to this forum blog post and add a more detailed list, and re-engage in that discussion. I think that would make sense.
Also, Marcus and Ronan, if you're interested, like I was talking to Bope right around the Celo Real process, and because he found a way to make it just two to three proposals, which is less than what Celo Euro was, right? We talked about standardizing it in a way where we can create like a documentation around every step that needs to be done in a documentation, like document it well and standardize it. So that anyone who can like want to propose something, they at least have like also the technical step that they need to do in order to submit a proposal for a specific currency. So Ronan, I don't know if you're interested, I can connect you to Bope. I can help work on this where we can create a standard, because Bope, you know, he had it all in his head and he just freshly created the Celo Real proposal. So he has a lot of ideas around that. So maybe we can standardize it if that's interesting. Cool. All right. So we're 1 minute until time. I think that's a great time to end this call. So let me stop sharing. And yeah, I want to thank everyone here for taking time to take this call. I think it was a really interesting discussion that happened here for multiple different topics. And yeah, I hopefully will see you all again on another call for the Celo governance. And thank
Thanks,
you.
Yas.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.